Hello, I'm Dennis Priebe. I am the revivalist for Amazing Facts, and I've been asked to share a little of my background, my life history. This is about as close as I'll ever get to doing an autobiography for two reasons. Number one, I'm not a big fan of writing my own biography, so I'll probably never do that. And number two, my life isn't all that exciting, so I have no desire to share all my life history with the world. But I've been asked to go through a few things that have happened in my life for the purpose of helping us understand where we are and why we're here in the Seventh-day Adventist movement of today. How did we get here? What happened during the years that have gone by? And what is significant in that? So I'm just going to start at the very beginning. I'm going to go back to my beginnings as a Seventh-day Adventist, and I was very fortunate to be able to be born into a Seventh-day Adventist home. I had outstanding Seventh-day Adventist committed parents that did their very best to bring me into a full understanding of what it is to be part of a end-time generation. And so I'm very grateful for that. They sacrificed greatly to put me through Adventist schools, and so I give them so much credit for my life and what it has been. Now I'm going to pick it up about when I went to academy. We lived in Sacramento, California, and I went to Lodi Academy for my academy education, and I had an excellent Bible teacher there. His name was Herbert Greer, and during that period of time I made a commitment that I wanted to be a minister in some way, and so I went to Pacific Union College to take the theology course to train to be a minister. What I remember most about my experience at Pacific Union College was the excellence of the teachers that I had at that time. They were men, as best I can tell by knowing what other schools were like, they were the best teachers that I have come across in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in terms of religious teaching and training for the ministry. There were men there like Carl Kaufman, who later went on to be the chairman of the religion department at Andrews University. There was Robert Olson, who later went on to be the director of the Ellen White Estate in Washington, D.C. Leo Van Dolson, who became an associate editor of Ministry Magazine. And these were the individuals that shaped my understanding of Adventist theology. And then there was W.T. Hyde, who didn't go on to be anything in particular except a great Bible teacher. And he was the one that most helped me to understand what my theology would be as a Seventh-day Adventist. So those were the really good foundations for my beginning and my understanding as a Seventh-day Adventist and what I was going to do. During those years, there was this was in the period of the 1960s, and there were some things going on, but not nearly the kind of shall we say agitation that we have experienced in the last years. It was a pretty calm period. I grew up in a Seventh-day Adventist church in which ingathering was the big event of the year. And we went out and sang Christmas carols and gathered money for the world missions, and that was my boyhood as a Seventh-day Adventist. And then there was always the Signs campaign, Signs of the Times, in which everyone was asked to sponsor a certain number of subscriptions to people who needed to understand the gospel and Seventh-day Adventism. And that was my beginnings. Of course, there was Pathfinders, which is still around today, and the things that normally a Seventh-day Adventist child would be part of. So that was my roots in the Seventh-day Adventist background. So at Pacific Union College, was able to learn from some, I think, of the very best minds in Adventism, and to understand what the issues really were. And so I began to try to formulate my own thinking, my own beliefs, my own thoughts. And again, I credit Elder W.T. Hyde for so much of where I am today and what I have believed. And again, not too many people know of him. He's not a famous figure, but many times it's that way. The ones that are least out in the front and are the stars are sometimes the ones who help the most to form backgrounds and share. So that again was my experience. I was called to be a minister, a young minister at that time. I told the Lord that if I'm a Northern California boy, grew up in this area, and I told the Lord privately that if there's any one place that I hoped He wouldn't call me to, it would be Southern California. Guess where my call came from? Southeastern California Conference. And that's where I began my ministry. I was an intern for a year at San Diego Broadway. Then what was very apparent to us young guys at that time was once you got beyond your internship, you were sent off to the Far Eastern Division. Of course, that meant for Southeastern California, the desert. And so we were sent out to the desert as our first pastorates. And I became the pastor of the Brawley Seventh-day Adventist Church, not very far from the Mexican border. And that was for my first year. Then we were asked to go to Indio, near Palm Springs. And that's where my son was born, and we spent some very good years there. I'm really, really thankful for the lay leaders of churches like that helped me to know how to relate to people and how to be a pastor. They taught me more than I taught them. And so that was a very productive time. Then I was asked to go to San Diego, back to San Diego, to the Imperial Beach Church, where I spent a number of more years as a pastor, learning again more about practical life than about theology. I had already been to the seminary for 2 years of training, and that's where, again, beyond Pacific Union College, the theological foundations were laid. But being a pastor and learning how to relate to people was extremely important for the rest of my life. So that at that point, we were trying to decide what the best thing would be for us to do and be. I was ordained at the Loma Linda Seventh-day Adventist Church, one of the largest churches, of course, in the denomination. And Matthew my son was actually born at Loma Linda University Hospital. And so that, again, was the very, very foundation of where we were. It was after that, when we were living in San Diego, that I received an invitation to do something that I had never done before in my life, and that was to teach in the classroom at Pacific Union College. And so that became a part of a decision-making process because I had not trained to be a teacher. I had trained to be a pastor. And so this was a brand new experience for us, a new challenge. Would I be effective in a classroom experience at a college level? And the reason that I considered this very seriously was that I remembered the quality of the teachers at Pacific Union College, the education that I had received there, and those teachers were still there. They were still a part of that religion department faculty, and so I thought to myself, where better could I be mentored and guided except by teachers of that quality? So we made the decision to join Pacific Union College and the faculty, the religion department faculty there, and try to learn what it was, how to best be a teacher in the religion department for both general students and theology majors. And that became the challenge of that time. The first year was a kind of a tough year to try to put together course schedules and syllabi and get all the lectures arranged for the very first time in my life. And I can just say, I am so grateful for people like Carl Kaufman, who became a real mentor to me and guided me and gave me very, very good direction as to how to be effective in the classroom. And so we spent that first year trying to learn how to be a teacher when I'd never trained to do that before in my life. And that became the challenge of that time. Then as we began to kind of fit into the total perspective of a college experience and a college environment, I began to be more and more comfortable with that and felt that this was probably where my real abilities and my calling was. And I began to be extremely happy that the Lord had led us in this direction. So we continued to try to put together the best courses and the best ideas. I taught general students like Life and Teachings of Jesus and Bible doctrines and Bible themes. And later on, I began to teach the theology majors on basic theology of Seventh-day Adventism and how to share that theology and how to make it practical. And so this became, again, part of our lives and part of our experience. So I think that's probably enough of an overall background as to where I came from. I now want to get into some of the real issues that began to surface around the period of the 1970s and leading into the 1980s, which is where I really want to focus now and take a good look at what this was. During that time, we had, again, a very, very sound, in my judgment, religion department. Again, I'm going to say I think it's probably the best department that I know of at that time with the individuals that were there. I look back to my time as a student there during the 1960s, the early 1960s, and we didn't always have perfect teachers during my student years at Pacific Union College, but we had leadership at that time that pretty well knew if things were not the way they should be. We had a few teachers during my student years in the early 1960s that were not as clear on Adventism as they should be, and they raised some doubts and they raised some questions in student minds. And those teachers, within a year or two, were gone. They were no longer part of the faculty at Pacific Union College. But when I came back as a teacher in the middle 1970s, things had changed a bit. As I said, I'm so proud of the teachers that were there during the 60s and the 70s. But by the mid-70s, a new president had a different philosophy than the one that I went to school under in the early 60s. His philosophy was that the religion department was much too one-sided. It did not have enough variety. There were not enough different viewpoints expressed. And since we live in a society in which people like to have different viewpoints and society was moving into different ideas, we need to have a diversity of experiences in the religion teaching at Pacific Union College. And so the ones that I had been so fond of and respected so much, they began to take calls to other places, and new teachers were brought into the religion department, younger teachers, charismatic teachers, and they began to shape the department in a different way. And again, something happened that was very significant, and that is the kinds of teachers that might not have lasted in the 1960s were now applauded, promoted, and encouraged to be part of that kind of thinking in the 1970s. So within about 15 years, the climate had changed in that college. And now we were beginning to hear of different things, and some things began to happen that were not as good as I had hoped they would be. So I think I'll leave it right there at this point, and then we'll come back after a little break, and we'll talk about what really changed and how that change is affecting us to this day. But there's one more thing that I'll say, and that is when I was about 13 years old, something was happening that I didn't even know anything about. At the very top levels of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in about 1955 to 1957, there were discussions about what our gospel was really like. And the discussions were between certain evangelical leaders who had come to talk to Seventh-day Adventists about whether or not we were a cult. And so during that period of time, major decisions were made. And of course, I was totally unaware of this. I was about 13 years old. So I had no understanding of what was happening during the 1950s. And again, the person that I credit most with making me aware of these things was Elder W.T. Hyde at Pacific Union College. As we sat in his class as theology majors, he would explain to us exactly what happened in those discussions that were taking place between evangelical leaders and Seventh-day Adventists. And he would lay out the individuals that were involved and what each individual believed. And again, I am so grateful for that background. Of course, when I was growing up, I was totally unaware of anything like this. But he was the one who opened my eyes and shared with all of us what was really happening. As again, Walter Martin and Donald Barnhouse came to the leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and challenged the church as to whether or not we were a cult or a mainstream Christian church. And the book that came out in response to that was the book Seventh-day Adventists Answer Questions on Doctrine. And in that book, we began to move from some of the positions that we had held previously on things like Jesus Christ and how what he was when he came down to this earth. What nature did he have? And we began to move from our positions on whether or not there would be a people who would live without sin at the end of time. And those became very significant issues as they developed. So that became part of the mix that I was exposed to first at Pacific Union College as this developed. So now, as we come back, I want to move into the area of what happened at Pacific Union College that was representative of what was happening in the Adventist world at large.